Open Democracy live discussion. I think we'll be taking around an hour this afternoon / evening to talk through some of the work that our contributors from Ukraine have been doing over the last year. My name is Daniel Trilling. I'm an editor at Open Democracy. And I work across various bits of the site, but one thing I've been doing a lot of work on over the past year is working with some of our contributors from Ukraine and other post-Soviet states, particularly on coverage responding to the full-scale invasion that was launched a year ago this week. I won't be saying too much myself. I'm just here to chair the discussion, but we've got three really valuable and I hope fascinating panelists to talk to you today. I'll just introduce them very briefly, and then I'll just give you a few comments on how I think we'll run the event today. But joining us today, first of all, we have Igor Burdyga, who is a regular contributor to Open Democracy. He's also a correspondent for Deutsche Welle's Ukrainian service. He's reported widely on the 2014 EuroMaidan revolution, Russia's annexation of Crimea, the military conflict in eastern Ukraine, and the 2022 Russian invasion. Joining Igor is Kateryna Semchuk. Kateryna is Ukraine correspondent at Open Democracy, where she covers the human and socio-economic impacts of Russia's invasion, and she's been doing that in a very concerted way for us over the past year and digging out stories that I think are really outstanding among what is now a very crowded field of journalism being done on Ukraine. And then last but not least, we're delighted to have joining us Oliver Bullough, who is a journalist now based in the UK, but has worked extensively in Ukraine and Russia. He's author most recently of Butler to the World, How Britain Became the Servant of Tycoons, Tax Dodgers, Kleptocrats and Criminals. And just before that, the book Moneyland, Why Thieves and Crooks Now Rule the World and How to Take It Back. So just before I hand over to the panelists, I just wanted to say a few words about Open Democracy and the kind of work we've been trying to do on Ukraine, particularly over the past year. Open Democracy, for those of you not so familiar with our work, we're a non-profit journalism project that covers news and politics in several different bits of the world. And I think one of the threads that brings all of our various forms of work together is that we're very interested in struggles for rights and equality, wherever those might arise. We're interested in covering those, as reporters, but also giving a platform to people engaged in those kind of struggles themselves directly. And we really want to analyze and name the systems that are responsible for holding back those struggles for rights, equality, democracy, accountability in public life, and so on. We've been doing this for a long time in our work focused on the UK, and also with the project ODR, focused on countries in the what's often called the post-Soviet space. So we've got this really strong grounding of work on Ukraine, Russia, other countries in the region, how those countries relate to other bits of the world and so on. And I think that knowledge and expertise has really shown through in the kind of coverage we've been able to give to the war in Ukraine over the past year. And one of the things that I think has been particularly strong about Open Democracy's coverage is that we've been able to draw on the knowledge and expertise of journalists who live in Ukraine, who understand that country in a way that many correspondents who are brought in from the outside perhaps don't. And I'm really glad we've got both Katya and Igor to talk about their work here. I think before I hand over to the panelists, I'd just say one more thing, which is to thank anybody over the past year who has supported Open Democracy's work on Ukraine and on other related subjects. We're really glad that people have, first of all, read what we're publishing, that they've shared it with other people, and also grateful to people who've donated to support our work, because we are funded partly by reader contributions and we can't do it without that kind of support. I would also just say, just as a tip more than anything, do please sign up for our regular ODR newsletter, which I hope my colleague Anita can post a link to in the chat, or we can circulate afterwards, because that's the best way to stay updated on the stories that we're producing from Ukraine and from the wider region. So that's more than enough for me, I think. What I'd like to do now is to first turn to Katya. So Katya, you've been a correspondent for openDemocracy for coming up to a year now. Obviously, you've got a lot of experience as a journalist and writer on sort of social and economic affairs in Ukraine and other kind of political issues. But over the past year, you've, I think, developed much more strongly as a reporter. So you've learned some new skills in doing that, but you're applying all of this knowledge that you have brought to the job from the work you've done in the past. So I just wanted to begin by asking you, perhaps for readers who are less familiar with your work so far, what are the kind of stories that you've chosen to focus on over the past year? What particular aspects of the war and of Ukrainian life more generally have you chosen to report on? And what is it about those topics that you think is so important to be telling readers around the world about?
Good evening to everybody who joined this evening. Thank you, Daniel. I'll try to make a few notes to remember what to to cover. Yes, I joined officially openDemocracy as a Ukrainian reporter in last July. Before that, I wrote some articles for openDemocracy, so we were acquainted. And I'm coming from more of activist journalist background. I worked for 7 years in news at the media called Polityczna Krytyka, political critique. It's a small leftist. Began with volunteer work, volunteer-led media, and then also did some writing on the site, but mostly this, I think, experience was particularly helpful and uncovering the subjects that I cover during the war for openDemocracy. This is social issues, more of human stories, and how I would say the complexity of different circumstances, and also how they influence day-to-day life of regular Ukrainians. So I think my coverage for openDemocracy also comes from some limits to my work, is that we don't go to specifically active battle, the regions that are in active battle for security reasons. So coming from that, I reach to stories I can reach basically from my place where I live. It's Kyiv. You would say there are different degrees of safety in Kyiv, but still it's a country at war. So yes, and I think as we know, Ukraine is covered by a lot of people and journalists at the moment. And I would say, and I wrote about this also, is that a lot of issues that include something that is happening inside Ukraine, not on the battlefield and not on the international scene, where Ukraine has also more and more coverage. This is something that I'm interested to cover, and also fortunately that openDemocracy is also interested to cover. And this is some of the results of reforms that have began before the war, some of the changes in society that had been already prior to Russia's invasion, and are now becoming also visible, and also I would say in need of coverage because of the lack of coverage on for the international media that they do. And also, I think my interest is in maybe giving also different kind of image of Ukraine, and only the one that is always linked to war zones, conflicts, problems, and suffering and violence. Although it is really important, but there are some processes there just overlooked.
Yes. So thanks, Katya. I think that's a really nice overview. And I was just thinking when you were saying that, if there's sort of one short way in which I could, at least the way I see it, that I could sum up the journalism you've done, it's to show that politics has not stopped dead in Ukraine just because it's in this very dangerous and threatening situation. That many of the issues that Ukrainians found really important and vital to the future of their country before February 2022 are still going on, but they now are, debates, social conflicts, arguments, and so on are unfolding in a new way that has been really transformed by the situation that Ukraine is now in. And I think if one reads the reporting that you've been doing, it shows how not only is it really important to keep covering these things, but you can't understand the war fully without understanding what's going on. And I just wondered if we could, before I go, I'm going to go to Igor next, but I just wondered if we could just pick up on a specific story that you've worked on in the last year that illustrates this. And for me, if this is one you're ready to talk about, the one that illustrates how all these things come together the most clearly for me is in the reporting that you've done on the relatives of prisoners of war. So this is it's a complex story. It's one that doesn't always show the Ukrainian authorities in the best light, but also is completely vital to what I think the majority of Ukrainians will be feeling at the moment, which is the war effort. And it kind of is where what's happening in the military, sort of on the military side of things, links absolutely to what's going on in Ukrainian society more broadly. So would you just talk us through the reporting you've done on that issue, and maybe also just tell us about what it was like to actually kind of go out and do that reporting? Were there particular challenges to it that you had to overcome?
Yes, thank you. So yes, I think the war creates some of the issues that are not like prior to, they are not on the front line of Ukrainians' concern, like survival and fighting to take back Russia, but are still are pose the question of equal rights and equal treatment, and something that maybe government doesn't have resources and also people to deal with, or there's no system put into the place when the war, the full-scale war erupted. So this is, I think, one such issue is issue of prisoners of war, Ukrainian prisoners of war in Russian custody, where I probably discovered how relatives of those who had been captured by Russian military and placed sometimes in prisons or different camps have difficulty in communicating with the government and institutions that are responsible for returning those prisoners, and they were frustrated at the lack of cooperation with the relatives, or problem influencing any decision making, or they felt sometimes how if they wouldn't act immediately, or they will be silent for a moment, that Ukraine will probably forget or leave the issue to resolve itself. And they were, this is, I think, also creates the problem of criticism of the Ukrainian government at time of of war, and we tried to cover that. And I think the biggest issue I stepped upon writing this is that the government wasn't also cooperative in responding to journalist requests. It was difficult to get any response from the Ministry of Defense or on this issue, because they that much try to avoid communicating anything about prisoners. To actually, I have to say, to not to so that the exchange wouldn't fall through, because there are lots of different stakes on Russian side and Ukrainian side. It's a complex process, so that's also like a journalist's responsibility to understand and to take that into account.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Katya. And I think that touches on something that it's difficult for journalists at the best of times, but is a real challenge, obviously, in a situation of war like Ukraine, which is that to do your job as a journalist, something I think we've all had to do, you have to ask difficult questions, and you have to push back against, people in official positions who don't necessarily want to release the information you want. And, sometimes that doesn't put, even institutions that you might be broadly supportive of as a journalist, sometimes you find out stuff that doesn't put them in the best possible light. And that's a fundamental part of independent journalism, is the ability and freedom to do that. And I think, as I know you've written about, both for us at openDemocracy and most recently The Guardian as well, that being able to do that journalism independently is not in conflict with the priorities of Ukrainian society at the moment, but it's actually a really, really essential part of it. I think this is a nice moment actually to move on to Igor, because as Katya was saying there, one of the things that has limited the reporting she's able to do is the changing military situation in different bits of the country. But Igor, I know, has done a lot of reporting for openDemocracy and elsewhere, particularly on the city of Kherson, which is in southern Ukraine, and is somewhere that was occupied by Russian forces early last year at the beginning of the invasion, but has since been deoccupied. So I think it tells you about another feature of life in Ukraine over the past year that has been equally challenging for journalists to respond to, which is that the military situation has changed quite drastically and sometimes at very short notice, and journalists have had to work out how to keep up with developments there. So Igor, I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about maybe like your priorities as a reporter over the past year, like what it's been important for you to focus on, and then a bit more about the situation as it's been developing more recently in Kherson itself. So do we have Igor still with us? And Igor, are you unmuted?
You? And now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Sorry. Thank you, Daniel, for your question. And first of all, maybe I should explain why I started reporting about Kherson. I never did it before. By the way, it's my native city. I was born in Kherson, but I moved from there like in 2007 when I started to work as a journalist. And I started cooperating with openDemocracy like in 2015, maybe, with some different topics, because of when you're working as a journalist in Ukraine in like 15 years like me, you're changing topics like only your main topic is changing like every 2 or 3 years. I started from mobile technology and IT journalism, then to agriculture business, then to revolution, then to war, then to human rights, etc., etc. I covered some high crimes for openDemocracy, like Babchenko murder, some media cases. And as far as I remember, in April last year, when I lived in Lviv, I moved to Kyiv in the beginning of the war. I should care about my family, and it was like a main task. And the journalism moved to the second place for me. I talked with Tomer Oldy, who's an editor, who's now my editor, and we just started to discuss what topics should I cover. And that was like maybe a little bit stupid proposal to cover the stories from my native city, because I never did it before. It was like I leave the city behind. But the situation was really dramatic, and it was very personal at that moment. The end of April, beginning of May, the situation was changed like very dramatically. The people in Kherson, friends of my mom, my friends, my former friends, my school friends, my university friends, who was in the city, who should stay in the city because there was no way to leave Kherson at that time. They feel this themselves like everyone lived him, and everyone forgot about him. So we decided that to cover Kherson and to cover the voices of Kherson is really like a gentle mission, maybe something like that. And it was completely interesting because it was the time of like a 2 or 3 power in the city: the Russian occupation administration, the local governments, some of resistance movements, and a lot of citizens who just want to escape. And it was really the third movement. So we start, and now I look at a openDemocracy website, and I wrote like 3 texts about Kherson during the year, and I'm planning to write the 4th. It's about how the Kherson lives now a new reality after the liberation, when the Russian forces are still on the left bank of the Dnieper. You should open the map to look at it. It looks like very strange, and it looks like 3 months after the liberation of the city, yeah? And the situation looks like a very dramatic. It's daily shelling through the Dnieper River from the both sides of the river. The Russian troops shelling right by the artillery to the city. The city that they called that's a new Russian city, and now they are shelling them. And just yesterday, it was the very, very scary situation where they, after the shellings, 5 people dies just on the bus stop. And it's new reality for the Kherson people, the people of Kherson, for the citizens, for those citizens who live in the city. They are living it in new reality when it's the frontline city with Ukrainian administration, with Ukrainian governments. They waited for them like 8 months. But it's like more dangerous and more scary situation like the Russian was in the city. Because when the Russian was in the city, Ukrainian forces didn't attack the Kherson by rockets, by artillery, by missiles, etc. So maybe I talked about this small town in the south of Ukraine too long, because it's really like a small town of 300,000 people. It was like not very interesting, a little bit of agriculture, boring city. All the industry completely dead in this city before, long before the war, maybe in 90s. So maybe that's why the second target for my interest during this war was Kryvyi Rih, the city nearby. This was in this close to Dnipropetrovsk region. So I really was wondering, and it was really good idea to write the war report about Kryvyi Rih. First time I visited Kryvyi Rih like 2 years ago, and it was also for openDemocracy to write about local walking movement, about miners' protest, and it was I was very inspired by the industrial city that I never was before. So maybe this contrast between the central huge, large industrial city that stopped the Russian invasion to the central region and to the north, and it contrasts with the small South Ukrainian town of Kherson. That's another way I look for, and I like to explore and to explain. Maybe back to your question about the condition when Ukrainian journalists worked for, and about the change in the situation. I think I should talk about the target, and not even about the target, but about the main reason to write and to tell the story, because as well as a lot of Ukrainian journalists, I face it like such a dichotomy between working for the Ukrainian audience and working for foreign audience with openDemocracy like I'm doing before. And it's a very difficult moral situation, as you told before, for the being the free journalist, like, you know, with free changing of topics, with free changing of views, it was independent. When your target is to keep the independent view on the things in Ukraine, you face it now. You should face the huge problem, because the media landscape was one of my topic for during the years, and what I see now is the real dichotomy for Ukrainian journalists is to write for Ukrainian audience and be not so dramatic and not so pessimistic about this war, and to keep the moral moral of nation. Fucking I don't know how to explain it. This something strong. It's and when you at the same time when you write into the Western audience or to foreign audience, you should ask. You should always remind for help. And it's a little bit difficult, because when you, as for me, everything is when you're trying to keep yourself as an independent journalist, as an independent Ukrainian journalist, you should keep in mind the Ukrainian independence as not as an object of the Russian invasion or Western support, but as the subject of the history that's now going in Europe, maybe in war, or something like this. And I mean independence of Ukraine and the independence of people of Ukraine, probably first of all.
Yeah. So if I can just jump in there, I think you've hit on another really important point for this discussion, which is I suppose that journalists are very often under these sometimes conflicting pressures, you know, about the sort of, you know, on the one hand, you're trying to tell stories about particular places, you know, like you say, this small city of 300,000 people, and in a way that it's an unremarkable place to be telling stories about, but obviously at the same time it's very revealing to show what a society is going through, what resources they have to draw on in a time of conflict and so on. And you're trying to link those local stories up with national and international concerns and find the connections between them. And I actually thought that that's a good point at which to just turn to Oliver. So Igor and Katya, I've got a few follow-up questions that I'd like to ask both of you about what you've said, but let's just hear from Oliver a bit first. Because Oliver, you have, you know, you've worked extensively as a reporter and journalist in Ukraine and Russia. You've been based in a region at points in your career, but you are now based in the UK, as far as I know, and a lot of your recent journalism has been, on the face of it, more UK focused, but obviously there are big kind of international connections between those two areas of your work. And I just wondered if you would mind just telling us a bit about that, like how, in the course of your reporting over the years, have you tried to connect up what you've seen in Ukraine or the way it relates to Russia with some of the things you've investigated and reported on in the UK and elsewhere in the world?
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. And it's really great to be on this panel with Ihor and Katya. I'm totally fascinating to hear what you've been doing, and you know, keep up the good work. I'm going to keep this short because I want to hear more from them. But I used to live in Moscow. I've worked in Kiev and elsewhere, and in Eastern Europe very widely for many years. And it became increasingly clear to me that I couldn't understand that part of the world without writing about corruption, because so much of what was the problem that was afflicting Ukraine or Russia or Kyrgyzstan or wherever was caused by corruption. And you don't have to research corruption for very long to realize that corruption isn't a Ukrainian problem. It's a problem caused at least as much by Britain as it is caused by Ukraine. The money ends up in Britain. The money flows through multiple British-owned tax havens, and therefore we are at least as much a cause of that problem is the Ukrainian politicians who steal the money in the first place. So what I try and do is to trace the secret mechanisms, the secret people who organize corruption services to allow politicians to be corrupt. Because I think without those services, the countries of Eastern Europe, Ukraine and others would have had a far easier time establishing democracy. It would have been far harder for Vladimir Putin to undermine their prosperity, their democracy and their cohesion. So much of what went wrong in Eastern Europe and in Crimea, in Eastern Ukraine and in Crimea was caused by the fact that so many of the local officials were corrupt, could just be bought off by Russia back in 2014. And I'm sure the same is happening now. We just earlier this week, we held a Kleptocracy tour in London. That's something we do to highlight the luxurious properties that are owned by oligarchs in London. And on our tour is always the tube station and mansion belonging to Dmytro Firtash, a Ukrainian oligarch who did very well trading Russian gas with Ukraine and with Western Europe, made a very large fortune and invested that fortune primarily in the UK, including in 2014 buying a disused tube station from the British government. I don't think there is any story that more dramatically underscores the complacency, to put it mildly, of the British government when it comes to money that has been extracted from Ukraine by oligarchs and is being spent overseas. So, sadly, I mean, there have been changes to what Britain has been doing since the war began, or the full-scale war began in February last year. Some legislative changes, some various approaches to ways investigation is being done, but not nearly enough. And there is signs of sadly waning interest, particularly in this campaign to get dirty money out of our economies and to prevent oligarchs being able to launder and keep their money. So, this sadly is very much not over. So I'm going to stop there because I want to hear more from Igor and Katya.
Yeah, thank you very much, Oliver. I think that's really useful context. And I think just like Katya and Igor have said already, it reinforces the fact that this is an ongoing story. These things have not stopped. They've not ground to a halt because the war has sort of pushed them all out of the way. And I think journalistically, it's just as important to keep drawing those connections, even when that maybe is inconvenient for politicians who want us to keep quiet about it, because a war is a great time for politicians to say there are more important things to worry about than this or that you're raising. And sort of picking up on that idea of how things are still developing, I just wanted to come back to Katya first and then Igor, and actually ask you both the same question, which is, I suppose it's actually two questions in one. First of all, Katya, what do you feel like you've learned a lot, that's kind of learned new things about Ukrainian society over the past year that perhaps you weren't aware of beforehand? And sort of to follow on from that as well, are there ways in which you think sort of social attitudes have been changing as a result of the war? I know that's something you and I have been discussing in our in edits over the past week. So I think I think that's really fascinating territory. So I just wondered if you could say a little bit about that.
Yes, thank you for questions. Well, I think like I channel my journal through, I think, my experience as a Ukrainian, and I would say that I learned most about Ukrainians through this first it's the first year of the war, of full-scale Russia's war, and I keep learning because this conflict expanded not over the last year, but since 2014, and a lot of changes in Ukrainians' heads, and also political preferences and identities had been changing, and up until I think very last moment, that not everybody in Ukraine would feel that Ukrainians would respond to Russia's full-scale invasion, that unanimously, and that just resistance and ability to adapt to new challenges that Russia poses in terms of its war and strategies. I think every time amazes me. I think it's also something that I am trying to illustrate with my stories, how people understand the threat that they're standing against, and how they find smart ways to secure them, to probably be united, but also probably this is something probably that answers the second question, is that despite the war is, Ukrainians still care about the country they live in. They are, although the war seems to be the biggest issue, and everybody tries to keep that in mind, I think, in Ukraine, but nonetheless, people are not, they care about the same issues that they cared three last years. It's their salary, their security, their social benefits, in which place they live, where they live, they, how also the security of their own towns, not, and also probably, that's the. I hope I answered your second question.
No, yes, you did. Thank you, Katya. But I also think there was something else that I think came through very strongly in, when we've talked about this over the last week, when we've been thinking about it, which is that if anything, your feeling is that people's desire for justice has got stronger because, people are risking their lives to defend their independence as a country, and that means that people are more invested in the kind of demands for equality and justice than perhaps they might have been before. I wonder, Igor, is that something that you've noticed in the course of your reporting, or are there any other changes that you've seen over the past year? I also wonder, just because you were talking about how an unexpected thing is that you've returned to your hometown as a subject, which is something that you maybe never thought you would do. Are there things you've learned about the place that you knew so well as a hometown that kind of have surprised you?
Good to, it's hard to answer because, I spent like a couple of months to talk with a lot of colleagues of mine, the journalists or the politicians, and to explain that the south of Ukraine, the Kherson region, is not pro-Russian region, was not pro-Russian region, as a lot of people saw. The very popular question was why the Russian occupied the Kherson region so fast, like during, so now it's the anniversary is what's like less than a week. They took a couple of days to occupy this. And that's because of the Kherson citizens was pro-Russians? No, completely not. The resistance movement in the South Ukraine shows that even the citizens, inhabitants of South Ukrainian regions are Russian speaking, not so ever optimistic, maybe. They don't want to celebrate some maybe Western Ukrainian heroes or legends, but they are not pro-Russians. They are fighting for freedom. And back to the surprises or something to know new about the Ukrainian society. That's much harder to find something new when you report the war during 2014, maybe, and 2013, because the Ukrainian solidarity is the thing that you saw from EuroMaidan, probably from 2013. The ability and the brave to fight against invasion is the thing that you saw from 2014. The Russian-speaking citizen fighting against Russian occupation, the same. The same and the same. There are a lot of things that you saw before, and maybe the saddest is the saddest understanding is that the things can and will go worst time by time because it's the war, and the things go worse than the war. But the point that not surprised me, but that inspires me much more than even in 2014 is the ability and winning the people of Ukraine to protect the freedom. That's the kind of abstract freedom, probably. That's even not democracy in the Western understanding. That's even not fighting against corruption, because for me, as a Ukrainian journalist, as a person who looks at Ukrainian society during with the kind of professional eyes during 15 years, the people of Ukraine, they are not very fair. They're a bit corrupted. They love corruptions, a lot of them. They do corruption, but they don't love them, but they do corruption. Yeah, they want to judge another person, not themselves, even inside the society. They don't want paying taxes. They don't want to vote on the election, so they believe that all of the politicians are liars. But there is some abstract point about the freedom that no one can set to Ukrainian people how to live, and that was a small point. There was a huge controversy inside Ukrainian society through the 1 month before the war. There was a pro-Russian political powers, pro-Ukrainian opposition, pro-Russian opposition, opposition inside pro-Ukrainian opposition, and opposition against the Zelensky and the Petro Poroshenko and the jazz. A lot of controversial things was inside the Ukrainian society, but no one except the people of Ukraine can tell the people of Ukraine how to do. It was huge. Another example, and it's connected to Great Britain, maybe the situation in the March of the last year. There are strong politician rumors why the political negotiation with Russians stopped in the beginning of March, and one of this rumor is that Boris Johnson was the reason. He came to Kiev and proposed and promises the support and make Zelensky believe that they can win this war and fight Russia until the Europe death and something. But not the real reason for stopping these negotiations was the Bucha massacre, was the scaring of people of Ukraine, that the soldiers from the neighborhood country came to their country and start making this such terrible things. And I don't know, really still don't know what I'm thinking about it, but this war continues because the people of Ukraine wants it, because the people of Ukraine want to fight for freedom, and no one else. And that's why I'm talking about the people of Ukraine is the subject, not the object. Want to fight for freedom, and no one outside this country can have no possibility maybe to tell maybe for Ukrainian people what this freedom is completely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you've lighted on there is the way in which I think, in a way, the invasion over the past year has forced people in lots of different places to kind of confront the fact they didn't really understand Ukraine. There were Ukrainians, perhaps, as you were saying, misunderstood one another. There was this misunderstanding or misperception of what Kherson was and what the attitudes of people in that region were. And I think equally, being a journalist I've done a little bit of work in Ukraine, but mainly I've worked elsewhere. And I'm very aware of the fact that there are sort of these really fundamental aspects of Ukrainian society that were not very well understood a year ago or before. You know, the relationship between Eastern and Western Ukraine, or the Russian-speaking areas and Ukrainian-speaking areas, and so on. And that, if anything, and certainly, you know, from what I've learned from your journalism, Ihor, and your journalism, Katia, and of colleagues we've published at openDemocracy, is just how important it is to understand these, you know, the nuances of a society, if you want to understand why people behave the way they do, or why a war unfolds the way it does, and so on. I think, given that we've got just over 10 minutes left, it'd be really nice to open up to a few audience questions in a minute, and then come back to you both for any final thoughts. I just wanted to ask you, Oliver, one final question that maybe if you just give a very brief thought on, which is just on that kind of that idea that maybe Ukraine was not a very well understood country in the West, and perhaps we're, you know, just starting to catch up on that now. What kind of journalism would you like to see being done now on Ukraine and the issues surrounding it? Are there things at the moment, Oliver, that you think aren't being covered, or that correspondents from outside of Ukraine could be doing better?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with what Ihor was saying there. I mean, I think part of the problem has been that for many years, in fact, for always, Ukraine has tended to be covered by Western media outlets out of Moscow. You know, when I worked for Reuters, I was based in Moscow, and if we needed people in Ukraine, we would send them from Moscow. So inevitably, no matter how well-meaning we were, we arrived with prejudices that were current in Moscow. So essentially, a lot of Western journalism, and this is something that the Russians would probably disagree with, but I think this is true. A lot of Western journalism was very much seeing Ukraine through Russian eyes, simply because that was, you know, when we thought we understood it, we actually understood what Russians were saying about it. So, you know, but there have been some really Western journalists addressing Ukraine on its terms for a long time. Christopher Miller has been really very, very good for many years, Sabra Ayres, and some others who have been Ukrainian speaking and all that. But part of the problem has been that, you know, we tend not to know Ukrainian, we tend to know Russian. We tend to understand Ukraine, you know, with the best will in the world as an extension of Russia, simply because that tends to be where people come to it from. So, you know, I think there's no easy answer to this. It requires, you know, embedding journalists in Kiev, in other cities in Ukraine, as so many have been now, but for the long term. So we can really understand it as a separate civilization, as a separate country with its own, you know, language and tradition and history. Because, you know, it is too easy to listen to the loudest person, and the loudest person in the former Soviet Union it is Russia, and that does tend to be the viewpoint that gets listened to most of all. So, you know, I think it was Leonid Kuchma's autobiography was titled "Ukraine is not Russia." The fact that the president of the country felt the need to make that point on the front cover of his autobiography, you know, expresses pretty clearly the fact that that is something that has rankled for a long time, and with good reason, because, you know, for too long, I think we have tended to sort of kind of elide the two.
Thanks very much for that. And I think, just if I may add my own thought in addition to that, I think as well as that need to have journalists who are you know, actually really embedded in a country, understand that country on its own terms, as well as, or rather than on the terms that others would like us to see a particular country in. It's very important to have journalists who can draw these connections across borders and show that how seemingly unconnected situations in different countries are linked. And I think that's something that openDemocracy does really well in terms of its work following the money, for instance. I think that's another strength of our coverage in the last year. Apologies for the organizational self-promotion here, but it is our event, and I would, you know, those of you who don't know our work already, I encourage you to find out about it. But something I think we've done equally well over the last year, and I'm really admire colleagues who've done it, is being able to, you know, investigate stories here in the UK that expose those kind of links that Oliver was talking about earlier. The fact that the UK is this crucial clearinghouse for stolen money from both Ukraine and Russia, and how that's actually something that our own government and previous governments have been complicit in in facilitating. And I think more than ever, really, it's being able to not only have journalists who can work across borders in that way, but organizations that can connect up these different bits. You know, sort of local knowledge with global links being made is a very important thing, in my opinion. So I think we've got sort of just under 10 minutes now to see if anybody else has got questions. Anita, apologies, but I don't know quite how you're going to be able to relay them to me while I can't see the chat. Do you want to pick out a couple of questions and just repeat them to the panel, Anita?
Okay, sure. So there's a question here from Anthony Barnett. He says, "Thank you, Katia and Igor, for your wonderful, brave work under terrible conditions. The R in ODR stands for Russia. Do you think it is possible to reach out to Russians who oppose the war, like Kirill Kobrin or Kirill Medvedev, who also wrote..."
Medvedev. But yeah, go on.
Thank you. Did you catch the last part?
So is it possible to reach out to Russians who oppose the war? And then was there another part to the question, or was that was the gist of it?
That was the gist.
Okay, so either Igor or Katia, do you want to have a go at answering that?
Well, I can say that we have a Russian editorial team that work on that letter, and you should, although for the readers who read Russian, and there are also a lot of times those articles are translated into English and published in the same English language page. But yeah, there's a whole team that is working actually on covering Russia and the war through that site, I would say.
Yeah, thank you, Katia. And yeah, I mean, this is something I should have flagged up earlier, but the ODR section of Open Democracy, as Katia said, publishes in 2 languages. And I think, you know, again, another aspect of our coverage over the last year is finding ways in which we can make both of those bits work together: people's expertise in Russia, people's expertise in Ukraine, people's expertise in other parts of the former Soviet Union as well. Anita, perhaps let's have another question. Want to make sure we can fit a few in before our time is up, at least.
There's a question here from Tom Rowley for Igor. Are there any signs that Russian forces want to try and retake Kherson in the future?
Igor, did you catch that question, and have you got the internet connection
Yeah,
to be able to answer it?
Yeah, I catch the question. Sorry,
Cool.
I wrote it before. The question was about is there any approach to the Russian could take Kherson in the close future. I don't know how to answer. I'm not the military intelligence, but the last words of former Kherson major and now the pro-Russian governor of Kherson region, as a part of Russia, as they say, the part of Russia. It's just from yesterday. They have the plans to take it apart, to take it back, but I don't know how to do it. I'm not. Back to the question. I'm not very big military expert, but it will be very hard to do, to force the Dnieper River again as they move back in November. It will be very, very hard to take it again in the next couple of months. So I can say that it's completely impossible, but it will be very hard to do. And probably it was the second question I saw about did the Rus shelling speed up the evacuation from the city, as far as I understand? Yep. So
Yeah, I think so.
I haven't talked with the Kherson officials and with a lot of people in Kherson like yesterday, but the last time when I was in Kherson, it was December 24. It was the last mass shelling in Kherson, and it was like 10 people. Yeah, it was 10 people that this day, and the same evening it was the huge lines on the railway station. So yes, talking to the words of Kherson official, they can approve you that any huge shelling, any new victims, it really sped up the evacuation from the city, and it's now like maybe 15 or 20% of inhabitants are still in the city, like compared with the people they lived before the fire, well, like last year ago.
Thank you, Igor. So we're nearly up to the hour, although I think let's take just a couple of minutes to fit in one or two more questions and then go back to our three panelists for any final thoughts. There's a question from another audience member, again for Igor, to ask you to expand on something you said earlier, which was your comment that Ukrainians are perhaps good at being critical of others, but not very willing always to shine the light on themselves. So do you feel like saying a little bit more about that?
That's the point for my last discussion with colleagues who also cover some criminal cases or high-level criminal cases, or the new criminal cases that I will also, maybe it should be like an announcement, and maybe my next piece for Open Democracy was for searching for collaborators in the occupied region. So it's the I don't know, it's the kind of units during all of the years. The most of Ukrainians said that someone else should be blamed, not there. So that's the okay. That's an example. There's another trio in Kyiv against school physician teacher. Like it's like a 30 or maybe 28 or 29 years women who posted some pro-Russian propaganda on their Instagram. And she's blamed in high-level treason, as far as I know, not in collaborationism, but in high-level treason. And the prosecutors could put her in a jail like for 8 years. And I talked with the colleague of mine who covered this trio, and asked him, why do you cover this? It's like a very, very not interesting criminal case. Some stupid woman wrote some stupid things on Instagram. And he said, yes, but there is the very huge punishment, like from 5 to 8 years in prison. And I asked him, what the moral question you want to ask for your audience? Should her sitting in the jail like 8 years? And the answer will be yes. The answer for Ukrainian society in the Muslim will be yes, because the Ukrainian likes to judge another person. That's the story from little towns. Yeah, the people in little towns try to judge their neighbors. And it's very, 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 very Ukrainian story, as far as I understand. If I explain you, I can be sure there is the whole national characteristic, but it's very popular.
Yeah, and I'm sure we could have a whole separate discussion on national characteristics and so on. I think given our constraints in time, I think I'm going to draw this to a close now. I just wondered, just before we wrap up, Katya, was there anything else that you wanted to add? I wonder, I don't know, maybe what kind of support do you feel like journalists in your position and Igor's position really need from readers outside of Ukraine, for instance? Is there anything readers can be doing to support your work, or responses you would like them to have to it?
Well, I think that maybe, well, coming back to who tells the story about what. And I think even translating or giving asking Ukrainian journalists to write the stories, not some journalists who just end up in Ukraine without prior knowledge of the language or any sort of knowledge of the region, or was just covering war zone somewhere else. I think like understanding that the reporting would be different in those circumstances is essentially, I think we should also understand shortly.
Yeah, I think that's really important, Katia. Thanks for that. And I think that's a very good point for us to conclude on today. If there's one thing that I would love all of us to take away from the discussion, it's the importance of actually, reading and sharing people's perspectives on what is, going to be one of the most important issues in our part of the world and for the world more generally, in the months to come. I'm very proud of the role that Open Democracy has played in that, small as it might be, but I would just thank all of my colleagues on the team who, write, edit, promote the reporting that Katia, Igor and other colleagues have been doing on these and many other issues. I'd like to thank Igor, Katia and Oliver for their really interesting contributions to the discussion today. Sorry it's been short, but there's plenty all three of them have written that you can go and seek out now, and I encourage you to do that. And for those of you who were already familiar with Open Democracy before today, thank you very much for reading, sharing, perhaps even donating to us in the past. For those of you who are new to our work, welcome, and I hope that you carry on keeping in contact. I'll repeat it again, sign up for the great ODR newsletter, which will give you a weekly update on the stories that are coming out of Ukraine and elsewhere. And tell a friend. Tell a wealthy friend if you have them, that we always welcome reader contributions as well. So just thank you to everybody again for taking part today and for giving up part of your Wednesday afternoon to come and talk to us and be part of the discussion. Thanks for everybody who asked questions as well. Sorry we couldn't get through all of them, but I hope we've gone some way to answering questions that are in your mind, and hope to see you next time. Thank you very much.